Hey everyone, welcome back to the channel. Thanks for tuning in for another episode. As we start working our way into the later part of winter and into the early pre-spawn period, one of my absolute favorite baits to fish with is a lipless crankbait. They're an extremely versatile bait that allows you to fish from shallow to deep through all kinds of vegetation and is one of the best baits at triggering cold lethargic bass into biting. So I want to talk a little bit about the baits, kind of give you a different approach as to how I like to choose my lipless crankbaits. And it's a pretty simple thing. I bring it down to a couple of major factors. Now, there's a lot of different baits that will fit into each of these types of categories, but deciding which category is going to be most productive is generally the key to having very successful lipless crankbait fishing, especially in the coldest times of the year. So we're going to get into that. But before I do, I want to remind you guys that if you're looking to support the channel and you are looking to purchase some tackle, please use my Tackle Warehouse affiliate link to make those purchases. I'll put the link to Tackle Warehouse in my video description. And if you're not looking to purchase tackle, please just subscribe to the channel if you haven't done so already. That's a great way to show your support as well. All right, so let's talk a little bit about lipless crankbaits. So this one right here is the one that has caught me my personal best. This is a old Xcalibur one knocker. This is the ghost color, my absolute favorite color. It actually has caught me two of my three, if not three of my four biggest bass I've ever caught. I've got one that was just under 10 3/4 that I caught at Lake Chickamauga in a Bass Open tournament, which honestly didn't even win Big Bass of the event. I held Big Bass for two spots, I think. Daryl Davis, I think, weighed a 12-pounder, two or three people after me. But this is the bait I caught it on. I've also caught like one that was almost 9 on it, and I had one during practice down on the Harris Channel Lakes that was probably right in that 9 pound mark as well. But because I had people around me, I never took it out of the water. It was a giant fish, but this one has been just an amazing bait for me over the years. Uh, I love a lot of colors, but for whatever reason, this ghost color, which is kind of like a Tennessee shad color, has been extremely productive. But I love lipless crankbaits. I throw all different kinds of lipless crankbaits. Three of my favorite. You guys hear me talk about the Berkeley War Pig. This thing is an absolute fish catcher. I love that thing. This is one that I've thrown for a long time. This is this G-Fix Vibration, which is by Duo Realis. That's a really good one. Lots of good ones out there. Yozuri's got some good ones. The Striking Red Eye Shad is a good one. But for today, we're going to talk about these three just to kind of break down the categories that, to me, are most important when deciding which lipless crankbait to use. So the first thing I want to point out is kind of the way the bait is built. So in this case, let's talk about the old one knocker by Xcalibur and then the G-Fix. So both of these, when you look at the side profile of it, they look pretty similar. In fact, most lipless crankbaits will look very, very similar in size and build. But when I turn them this way, this is where the biggest, God, these hooks are sharp on these. This is where the biggest change is. So hopefully you can see how much narrower the G-Fix is over the Xcalibur. So that's the first big factor that I like to decide on what I'm looking for. The difference between these is when you see a bait that's a wider profiled bait, something like this, or your Striking Red Eye Shad, they're wider baits and they tend to fall slower. So when you're talking slower, a lot of times with a lipless, your best bite's going to come whether you pause the bait, whether you snap it out of some grass, whether you're kind of yo-yoing it off the bottom. The key here is there's a lot of falling motion. So when you're talking about these wider baits, they tend to fall a little bit slower. They tend to get a little bit more movement in them, which can be good, but it can also be bad. So that's one of the first things I'm trying to decide is where are the fish and how deep am I going to fish? So the G-Fix is a much narrower bait. This thing falls much faster because of that narrowness. Because of that, I'm going to be able to keep this near the bottom much easier, right? It's just a heavier bait, stays down deeper. And because of that, if I'm fishing in deeper water, when I say deeper with a lipless, I'm going to say like 8 foot deep or deeper. I really like to go with something like the G-Fix because it keeps me down near the bottom. If you're talking about the late winter, early pre-spawn, most of the time those fish are going to be bottom related. So you want to stay relatively close to the bottom, which is also where your cover is going to be. And you want to try to make contact with that cover. Now, if I'm fishing shallower than 8 feet, that's when a lot of my wider baits that have a little bit slower fall come more into play. Same goes for cover. If I'm fishing around some grass, so a lot of times early in the year, you start finding little places where your grass is about that tall off the bottom. It's just starting to grow. Or maybe you have some remnant taller grass. I like a slower falling bait like this because it's not going to really dive and get buried into it. It's going to almost rest on top, which allows me to snap it out of the grass, still get it out clean. It's a lot better versus a heavier bait that's narrower will just really nose bomb into it, and it's harder to snap that bait free. If I'm fishing around rock or I'm fishing a clean bottom, that's when I tend to like a heavier bait that stays closer to the bottom, going to make more bottom contact, just seems to work better for me. So the first thing I'm always looking for is what depth do I want to fish? What type of cover am I fishing? Based off that, I'll decide if I want a heavier bait that'll get down deeper or a lighter bait that doesn't really get buried into the cover. It kind of rides over the top a little bit better. After that, the next thing is I'm trying generally to decide what type of sound I'm after. So in this case, the one knocker has a single rattle. Makes more of just that single thump, or you've got a traditional lipless crankbait that's got a bunch of BBs. Just a much louder bait. Same thing here, the G-Fix. It's got a bunch of little BBs. For me, that makes a big difference. So, and the third one to throw in is a silent version. Generally speaking, I prefer the one knocker sound the majority of the time. Now, it's not always what I go with, but I do like that. I find that if I'm fishing very heavily pressured bodies of water, I like to go with something that's either silent or a single thumper. If I'm fishing bodies of water that are less pressured, I feel like the multiple BBs work better. If I'm fishing around water that is very muddy, I tend to like more BBs as well. I feel like that constant movement of the BBs allows the fish a much better ability to track that bait. But I will tell you, for me, it is always very important to play around with the different lipless crankbaits. Generally, if I'm fishing a tournament where I'm throwing a bunch of them, I'll have 3, 4 rods rigged with all different colors, all different variations, different styles, and it's unbelievable to me how frequently from day to day, if not from like hour to hour, one bait will be hot and the rest won't catch anything. And for me, it's really important to continue to switch through those different baits until I find the one that's working well that day. And that's not just my experience. I have talked to a lot of really, really good lipless crankbait fishermen, and they all tend to say that. There are very specific baits for whatever reason on specific lakes and times of the day that tend to produce better. A lot of it also comes down to weather conditions. If you've got sunny conditions versus overcast conditions, how deep you're fishing, it just really, you want to play around with the baits. Don't just pick one and throw it all day. That generally doesn't tend to play into the angler's favor. But it is really important, I think, to make sure that you're constantly rotating baits and you're choosing the correct lipless based on the conditions and the area that you're fishing. So hopefully you found this helpful. If you did, hit the like button, subscribe to the channel if you haven't done so already. Stay tuned, new video coming out tomorrow.